Okay, this is one of the most coolest incidents from the Seminole War. Question on my last video, somebody asked, is there anything that's been undiscovered? And yes, there really is. I actually found this letter about uh, probably more than 5 years ago. I was researching for the Alachua Ambush and came across a letter in the Adjutant letters, and I've never seen this letter reprinted in the newspapers or in the congressional reports or anything like that. I think because it describes in very good detail slaves attempting to escape with coordination with the Seminoles, and maybe they didn't want the word getting out on that was possibly happening, and some risk some of the other slaves here, put in the newspaper. It's going to get in out in word around St. Augustine, and there's slaves around town. They're going to hear about that and get in on the action. So this is pretty cool. So this is a letter I've not seen reprinted anywhere about an attempted slave escape during the Second Seminole War. This is from the Adjutant General letters. It's 1836 H150, and a little background into this. General Duncan Wilmot Clinch, head of the forces in Florida, 4th Infantry. He was head of that, I think, from about 1825 or 1826, and for the next 10 years until he resigned from the Army in 1836 and went to be a banker and investor in Savannah, Georgia, which I've previously shown his tomb. So he had several plantations. When you're a high-ranking Army officer, you usually have other side businesses going on because Army doesn't pay all that great. So he had a couple plantations in Florida. One which I may have mentioned previously, a plantation at Silver Glen Springs in the Ocala Forest. If you go up Highway 19, it's like right in the middle of the north part of the Ocala Forest. Silver Glen Springs, that was Clinch's plantation. That's the lesser known one, but the more famous one, he had Lang Syne plantation. Auld Lang Syne, the song sung in New Year's Eve. Uh, that was the name of his plantation that he had, which was now what's northwest of Ocala, near I think near the community of Amafala. And from there, he constructed Fort Drane in 1836. Fort Drane was kind of a rectangle picket fort. I was looking for a drawing. I couldn't find where it was at. Maybe Lieutenant Prince, Henry Prince, might have done a drawing of it. A rectangular fort with one blockhouse kind of in the middle of one of the long walls, just one blockhouse, and that's it. So not a very complicated fort, but he had sugar operations all around the fort for manufacturing sugar. So he had quite a number of slaves as well. And you're probably familiar with the Bulow Ruins, the state historic site near Bunnell, near Flagler Beach on the east coast of Florida, south of St. Augustine, one of the more picturesque and spectacular historical ruins in Florida. So if you ever get a chance, it's definitely photo worthy. There's about half a dozen plantation ruins that you can get to today, Port Orange and New Smyrna Beach, preserved and uh, different well, but Bulow is the biggest one here, and that's why a lot of people take some pictures of it. Here's one. It says Old Spanish Sugar Mill. Actually, that's not Spanish at all. Was promoted of that in Port Orange, Florida, New Smyrna Beach. The sugar mills of the Dunlawton plantation, New Smyrna Beach, became Fort New Smyrna, and Captain John Rogers Vinton was captain there, and he painted this painting. I don't know if those were the ruins that he had his soldiers camped around during the Second Seminole War, and he was an eyewitness to the war. So I don't think this was a scene he actually witnessed. I think it's more idyllic, and envisioned what it would be like if he was a Seminole looking over the smoldering ruins of the, if he was Kawakachi looking over the smoldering ruins of the plantation that he had just destroyed. Pretty neat. This is one of my favorite paintings of Vinton. And of course, here's the letter I'm talking about in the Adjutant General letters. Sorry, H-150. H, maybe that's Julius Heileman. I had some letters under Joseph Hernandez and also under Heileman. So this kind of going on in mid 1836 where the war started up. Sorry, I got something on there. As you can see, it's not easy to read. There's no punctuation, almost no paragraph breaks. So, it's confusing where it jumps in and out. And I did a pretty good job. It took several times reading over it to transcribe it. And there's only about 2 different places where I wasn't sure what they were saying, but they're not important. I think one of the interesting things why the letter also fell into obscurity is most all the people mentioned here, Captain Maitland, Captain Lemuel Gates, Major Lieutenant Colonel Julius Heileman. There's a Lieutenant Poole. All those guys would be dead not long after that, mostly within the next few months. Well, Lieutenant Poole, he died in 1839. In fact, I saw his grave in St. Augustine just a few weeks back. And there's Lieutenant Wagaman. I think that's what it is, George Wagaman. He actually was in Florida only a short time. A few months after this, he went to be an instructor in West Point and only briefly returned to Florida in 1842, and that was it. So that's why we don't hear his name involved in the war very often. So most all these guys were out of the picture within a few months, either dead or moved on. And so I'm going to read a transcription of the letter. These are the actual words that they use. So when I say the N word, it's because it's written here in the letter. And so from Fort Drane, June 12th, 1836. Sir, I took command of this post on the 29th ultimate. The strength of the garrison had been so much reduced by sickness and the withdrawal of the troops constituting the escort of the baggage trains that I found it impossible to keep up a guard at the sugar house and withdrew it on the 2nd instant. Fort Drane was notoriously for soldiers getting sick. So they're so sick they couldn't even keep up a guard of the general's sugar operation here, and retreated in the fort. On the morning of 2nd, a party of 15 or 20 Indians crept up to within 10 paces of 2 of our men who were gathering vegetables in a garden near the hammock south of the sugar house and fired upon them without effect. The men ran at once to their horses that were tied near and succeeded in setting loose one of them, which came in. So they released the horses and one came into the fort. The other was captured. The corporal of the picket guards, Vickers of F Company, 1st Artillery, ran immediately to the spot and with 7 men gallantly charged upon them and drove them in all directions. His conduct deserves high commendations. The same day, a party of Indians showed themselves in the hammock northwest of the post. 2 companies, C or D and F, 1st Artillery, commanded by Lieutenants Maitland and Wagaman, and a party of mounted men, they had some dragoons here too, were sent out immediately to surround and score the hammock. Although the movement was promptly made, the enemy made his escape and 4 of the troops reached their position. On the 5th, several men had been seen in the field south of the sugar house. A party of mounted men were sent out to reconnaissance, but before they approached sufficiently near to see them distinctly, they had all reached the hammock except one Negro who was brought in and proved to be one of General Clinch's gang. So the Indians had several slaves with them, include from General Clinch's plantation. The tracks of the men who ran off showed them to be a party of the enemy, and there is no doubt that the captured Negro who was holding communication with them. In the afternoon the same day, it was reported by the overseer that 11 of the Negroes were to go off that night with the Indians, who were at the same time to attack the place. Several circumstances concurred to confirm the truth of this report. The Negroes have all day been employed in setting off their little articles of property, and some of them had actually made up their packs, ready to move, and a rifle which had been stolen from me has been since found hid under the floor of one of their huts. It being very difficult to discriminate between the innocent and guilty, and no doubt being entertained that all of them were at least aware of the proposed arrangements, if not active participants of the, I caused all male Negroes, with unimportant exceptions, to be secured and have them now under guard employed in completing the defenses of the post. The enemy thus being eluded of his prey, made now the attack at that night, though it is believed he was in the vicinity. So that's really significant, talking about a plan of the slaves coordinating with the Indians to escape, having their possessions and packs made up, ready to go, stealing the rifle from the captain. And that's an offense that during that time you could be sentenced to death for insurrection or stealing a gun like that. So that's a pretty serious offense. In the afternoon of the 7th, it being reported that a party of Indians were lurking about the Negro huts, I had the howitzer taken outside and ordered out Lieutenant Maitland with his company, a party of mounted men. A shell was thrown among them, which caused them, by their yelling, to discover their position. Just as Lieutenant Maitland came upon them, he was received by a heavy fire, which he promptly returned. They retreated rapidly. So we have quite a skirmish going on here. Reaping up a returning fire to a hammock a mile distant, Lieutenant Maitland pressed closely upon them and followed them into a hammock until their fire being silenced. Further pursuit was deemed useless, so a heavy fire was opened on the detachment that I thought proper to send a reinforcement of our company under Lieutenant Wagaman, who met Lieutenant Maitland as he emerged from the hammock. The enemy was supposed to be 30 or 40 strong. Lieutenant Maitland's command, including 12 mounted men, amounted to 32. He sustained no loss. Soon after the return of the detachment, the Indians appeared in force, say 200 or 300 strong. So that's quite a change, going from 32 to 200 or 300 upon three sides of us. So, I guess they're yelling in the fort if nobody was injured and they're surrounded by 200 or 300. Yelling and firing off the rifles, though at so great a distance that their fire was totally or utterly ineffective. The howitzer was taken in the field in front of the blockhouse, and several shells thrown from it under the direction of Lieutenant Poole, which, with a few rounds from the 6-pounder, soon caused them to disappear. After it became dark, they slowly stole up to the sugar house, and having set it on fire, they as noiselessly withdrew a large quantity of corn and sugar, having been left at Oakland, which they have been of great value, of which would have been great value of the enemy. So it gets a little confusing here. I guess they had the sugar operations caught on fire at Fort Drane, and then it sounds like they're talking about McIntosh Plantation or Oakland Plantation, which I think was a Colonel McIntosh, who I think it's maybe the same John McIntosh, and near Darien, Georgia, had a plantation there, if I'm correct. But if you go north of Ocala on Highway 301, you'll get to the town of McIntosh, and that was Oakland right there. I detached Lieutenant Temple, who, having been stationed there, knew the ground perfectly for the important and hazardous enterprise of attempting its destruction. He was furnished a force of 24 mounted men, all that could be raised, and proceeded on the night of the 10th instant to put into execution. And it affords me great pleasure to bear testimony to the intrepidity and admirable coolness manifested by him throughout the affair. Upon emerging from the hammock into the open fields of the plantation, no, there's no punctuation in that. That's why it's like major run-on sentences. He perceived that the house and the fields had been fired by the enemy and were still in flames, casting a bright light upon all objects around. The nature of the ground making it necessary that he should halt his main body at a distance of 400 yards from the house. He advanced with only 4 men and had not proceeded 100 yards when an Indian dog, that's a canine dog, uh, came running up, gave a sharp yell, and ran back towards the house. Not intimidated by the circumstance, he went directly to the fire where, hearing the voices of men apparently engaged in a low and earnest consultation, stationed himself in broad glare of the light in order to keep his men in concealment while they're engaged in firing the buildings containing the sugar and the corn. So the Seminole are setting fire to the plantation operations here. After remaining long enough on the ground to see the glow take effect so as to prevent the possibility of its extinction, he moved quickly back to his main body and set off at full speed. So I guess they set the plantation on fire at Oakland or McIntosh just so it would not be of any benefit to the Seminoles foraging on the corn and the sugar left behind. He had not a moment to spare, for as the rear of the detachment passed from the field into hammock, the enemy was heard rushing down in large numbers to cut off, and the corporal who came last saw a man climb the fence by side of the road and heard him breathe hard as if he is running very rapidly. Sounds like me. Try to climb the fence. The enemy was completely foiled at his own game, and the detachment returned in safety and good order. All who composed it merit and will receive this our high praise. I enclose a copy of Lieutenant Maitland's report of his affair. Very respectfully, Lieutenant Lemuel Gates, Captain, 1st Artillery, to Major Julius Heileman, Commanding Regiment, Army of Florida. Little bit confusing what's going on with all the run-on sentences, but I think what's astonishing is the part of the slaves coordinating a breakout escape with the Seminoles, and might even be John Caesar involved too. I mentioned earlier in the previous video. So that's pretty cool. One of the more interesting episodes. And of course, as I said, most all the officers mentioned in the report would soon be dead, most of them, or out of Florida, and we wouldn't see them again. But kind of, I think it's very unique because part of the Second Seminole War, of course, was what they call a slave insurrection or a slave revolt, one of the many and probably one of the biggest in U.S. history. U-boat has long not been credited as such, like Nat Turner or the New Orleans or the Stongo Revolt or anything like that, but is finally getting some of the credit in the past few years on that. So I think that's pretty good. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that of that obscure Second Seminole War letter of incident that's really never saw the light of day after it was printed in the Adjutant papers. So that's all for now. Oh, and one more thing. He mentioned Lieutenant Maitland's report. Lieutenant Maitland's report was only about a page and really didn't add anything more to what was already said in the letter. I think I needed to mention that as well. So I'll talk to you later.